never imagined that betrayal could hide so well behind shared notebooks and late nights in the lab. For 5 years, I built prototypes, refined formulas, tested materials, and documented every failed and successful attempt in the same leather-bound journals that sat beside my desk. The inventions were mine in every meaningful way, born from sleepless nights and quiet breakthroughs. But I trusted the man who sat across from me at the work table to protect what we were building together. His name was Daniel, and officially he was my business partner, the one who handled investors, contracts, and presentations while I stayed buried in research and design. When our first patent was approved, I felt relief more than pride because the legal process had always made me uneasy. Daniel assured me everything was filed correctly, that our ownership was equal, and that the paperwork was standard. I believed him without question, not because I was careless, but because I thought loyalty grew naturally when two people created something from nothing. The company expanded quickly after that. Venture capital arrived, production deals followed, and our small workspace turned into a polished development firm with assistants and marketing teams. My role remained the same. I invented and improved while Daniel became the public face of innovation. The first warning came quietly. I attended a regional technology forum and noticed my own prototype displayed under Daniel's name alone. The placard described the mechanism I had designed in precise detail, yet my contribution was reduced to a footnote thanking the development team. When I asked Daniel about it, he smiled and said it was a temporary branding decision, something the investors recommended for clarity. I accepted the explanation, even though something inside me tightened with doubt. Weeks later, an email arrived from a licensing firm congratulating Daniel on the sale of one of our core patents. The message was addressed only to him and listed a payment figure that made my hands tremble. I confronted him again, and again he reassured me that everything would be sorted out in accounting, that these were routine transactions, and that my share would come later. I wanted to believe him because the alternative meant admitting that the foundation of my career had been stolen while I was standing beside the thief. The truth began to surface when I tried to access the patent registry myself. The system showed Daniel as the sole inventor on 3 of our most valuable filings. My name appeared nowhere except in internal drafts and early laboratory notes that had never been submitted with the official applications. My stomach dropped as I realized how carefully the theft had been executed. He had filed documents while I was overseas at a research conference. He had used my drafts but removed my authorship. He had signed contracts transferring ownership before I even knew they existed. Instead of confronting him again, I chose silence. I requested copies of old agreements from the legal department under the pretense of preparing a new funding proposal. I spent nights scanning archives, comparing timestamps, and reconstructing the timeline of every prototype I had created. Slowly, patterns emerged. Daniel had registered shell consulting firms that purchased licensing rights from our company and resold them at massive profit. Payments moved through layered accounts before landing in private investment portfolios under his control. The brilliance of the scheme terrified me because it meant he had planned this long before our first success. In the margins of my original journals, I found the evidence I needed. Dates, sketches, prototype serial numbers, and lab logs all predated Daniel's filings by months. Even more valuable were the internal development memos that bore my digital signature and server timestamps proving authorship. When I cross-referenced them with the patent office records, the discrepancies were undeniable. I learned that the International Inventors Exhibition would take place in 3 months and that Daniel would be presenting our flagship technology as the crown jewel of his personal portfolio. Investors, journalists, and patent officials from multiple countries would attend. It would be the largest platform he had ever used to celebrate his stolen success. Instead of leaving the company or filing a quiet lawsuit, I made a different decision. I prepared an audit. I hired an independent intellectual property forensic team and delivered every notebook, file, and archived email I had saved. Together, we traced the ownership chain contract by contract, payment by payment, until every hidden transaction was mapped in full detail. The final report was thicker than any patent application I had ever written. When the exhibition invitation arrived with Daniel's name printed in gold, I accepted my role as a guest speaker without telling him why. I booked my travel and prepared a presentation of my own, not to showcase invention but to reveal the anatomy of betrayal. By the time the exhibition doors opened, I no longer felt anger. I felt precision. And I was ready. The exhibition hall in Geneva was larger than any laboratory I had ever worked in, a cathedral of glass and steel filled with polished booths, glowing screens, and investors who moved through the aisles like quiet predators searching for the next breakthrough. Daniel arrived with a full entourage, assistants carrying tablets, legal advisors whispering behind him, photographers already lining up to capture his entrance. His banner hung above the central pavilion with his name alone in bold silver letters, framed by images of devices I had once assembled by hand in a windowless workshop. I walked past his booth without greeting him and checked in at the media desk where my guest badge waited. Officially, I was listed as a contributing researcher invited to speak in a technical panel later that afternoon. Unofficially, I carried in my briefcase the most complete forensic audit of intellectual property theft that the exhibition organizers had ever unknowingly approved for presentation. For weeks, I had worked with the audit team to reconstruct every layer of Daniel's operation. We discovered that 3 licensing firms purchasing our patents were controlled by a holding company registered under his cousin's name. The resale profits flowed through offshore accounts before reappearing in venture funds where Daniel held majority shares. Every step was legal in isolation but criminal in intent when viewed as a single system. Even more damaging were the altered patent drafts. Digital fingerprints proved that my original files had been edited minutes before submission to remove my authorship metadata. That morning, I received confirmation that the Patent Arbitration Board would have 2 senior examiners present at the exhibition. I sent them an encrypted copy of the audit with a formal request for emergency review citing fraudulent misrepresentation and ownership falsification. By noon, I knew that if I spoke carefully and publicly, the process would move faster than any private lawsuit ever could. Daniel took the main stage shortly after lunch. He spoke with confidence about innovation, collaboration, and ethical entrepreneurship while standing in front of projections of my designs. The audience applauded when he announced a new international licensing agreement valued in the tens of millions. I watched from the back row, calm enough now to observe the performance, as if it belonged to someone else's life. When my turn came, the moderator introduced me as a senior development researcher formerly associated with Daniel's firm. He smiled politely from the front row, assuming I would praise our partnership and confirm his story. I began by describing the early days of the company, the prototypes, the failures, and the breakthroughs. I spoke about documentation, about the importance of intellectual lineage, about how innovation depended on trust. The audience listened politely, expecting technical detail. Then I changed the slide. The first screen showed a timeline of prototype development with laboratory timestamps and digital signatures. The second showed the corresponding patent filings listing Daniel as sole inventor weeks later. I explained calmly how forensic software could verify authorship beyond reasonable doubt. The room grew quiet. Phones appeared in hands across the audience as journalists sensed a story forming in real time. I displayed contract chains linking the licensing firms to Daniel's holding company. I showed payment flows, resale profits, and final investment accounts bearing his indirect control. Each slide was sourced, verified, and prepared by independent auditors whose credentials filled an entire appendix. I never accused him directly. I let the documents speak. By the time I finished, the moderators were whispering urgently to the organizers. Patent examiners approached the stage requesting copies of the files. Security discreetly positioned themselves near Daniel's row as investors began standing, checking messages, and leaving the hall. Daniel tried to interrupt, but the microphone had already been muted. His face had turned pale, the confidence draining from his posture as quickly as it had once appeared. For the first time since I had known him, he looked small. Within an hour, the exhibition issued a formal suspension of his presentation and froze all licensing announcements, pending investigation. Journalists crowded the exits broadcasting headlines about the largest intellectual property scandal the exhibition had ever seen. By evening, Daniel's company stock had halted trading due to irregular disclosures. I returned to my hotel room exhausted but steady, knowing the hardest part was still ahead. Public exposure had opened the door, but restitution, ownership restoration, and legal consequences would require precision and patience. I had waited years to reclaim my work. Now the world was watching. The investigation moved faster than I had expected, not because justice had suddenly become generous, but because too many reputations were now at risk. Within 48 hours, the International Patent Arbitration Board announced a preliminary inquiry into Daniel's filings, and every major technology outlet began requesting interviews with anyone who had ever worked in our company. Investors froze new funding rounds, licensing partners suspended payments, and Daniel's lawyers released a short statement claiming a misunderstanding of collaborative authorship.
He called me that night.
His voice was soft, almost gentle, as if we were still partners working late in the lab. He said the situation had gotten out of control and that we should meet privately to clear things up. He said the audit was exaggerated and that lawyers were twisting technical details into accusations. He said we could fix this quietly, restore the partnership, even renegotiate ownership shares. I told him I had already submitted my evidence to 3 independent review panels and that all future communication would go through counsel. Then I ended the call. The next morning, subpoenas were issued. For weeks I moved between conference rooms and court buildings, answering questions, reconstructing timelines, verifying signatures, and explaining technical processes to people who had never touched a circuit board in their lives. The pressure was constant. Anonymous emails accused me of sabotage. Former colleagues avoided my messages. One investor publicly implied I was a disgruntled employee seeking attention. Daniel's legal team tried to bury the case in complexity. They argued that innovation was collective, that authorship was ambiguous, that metadata could be manipulated, that early drafts meant nothing without formal filings. They presented witnesses who claimed Daniel had guided the research from the beginning. They questioned my motives, my credibility, even my mental health after years of professional stress. What they could not explain were the contracts. The shell companies tied to his cousin began collapsing under audit. Bank records revealed profit transfers disguised as consulting fees. Timestamp server logs showed my original files being altered minutes before submission. An internal email surfaced in which Daniel instructed an assistant to remove my name from a draft and resubmit it under his own credentials. That email changed everything. The arbitration board issued an emergency injunction freezing all patents under Daniel's control. Production lines stopped overnight. Licensing partners canceled agreements. His board of directors forced him to take immediate leave pending investigation. Still, he refused to surrender. He filed countersuits claiming defamation and breach of confidentiality. He demanded damages for lost reputation. He accused me of stealing company data. The legal battle became public theater, streamed daily by commentators who debated whether I was a hero or a traitor. Through all of it, I kept working. In a borrowed laboratory funded by a university grant, I rebuilt my prototypes from archived backups. I refined designs that had been shelved for years. I filed new patents under my own name, this time with triple authentication and institutional oversight. Quietly, several research firms approached me with offers to collaborate, not because of sympathy, but because my work now carried proven value. One afternoon, my lawyer walked into the meeting room holding a thin folder and smiled for the first time in months. The arbitration board had issued its preliminary ruling. They recognized me as the primary inventor on 6 core patents and co-inventor on 3 others. Ownership was provisionally reassigned pending final judgment. All licensing revenue connected to those patents was frozen and placed in escrow. Daniel lost control of the company that same evening. His board removed him as chief executive and appointed an interim director. His accounts were restricted. His passport was flagged for potential financial misconduct. Reporters followed him everywhere, recording the slow collapse of the man once celebrated as a visionary entrepreneur. He sent one final message. It was not an apology. It was a warning. He said I had won a battle but not the war, and that people who exposed powerful systems rarely survived them professionally. I deleted the message without replying, because for the first time in years, I no longer needed to fight alone. The final hearing was scheduled for the largest innovation summit of the year, where the arbitration board planned to announce its full ruling publicly in front of regulators, investors, and international media. The same stage where Daniel had once taken credit for my work. And this time, the truth would not be whispered in conference rooms. It would be announced to the world. The Innovation Summit opened under a storm of anticipation. Security was tighter than at any conference I had ever attended. Lawyers, regulators, journalists, investors, and executives filled the grand hall where the arbitration board had reserved the central stage for the final announcement. Screens displayed the schedule in neutral corporate fonts, but everyone in the room knew only one item mattered: the ruling on the largest intellectual property theft case in recent industry history. Daniel arrived late. He walked alone now, without assistance, without advisors whispering in his ear. His suit was still expensive, but it no longer fit the man wearing it. His posture was rigid, his eyes darting across the room, searching for allies who no longer existed. When he saw me seated near the front with my legal team, he froze for a second, then forced himself to keep walking. I did not look away. For years I had imagined this moment in anger, in bitterness, in fantasies of confrontation. Instead, I felt only clarity. Everything that mattered was already written in evidence: timestamps, contracts, and digital trails that could not be argued away. The chair of the arbitration board took the podium exactly at noon. She spoke calmly about the importance of protecting innovation and maintaining trust in collaborative research. Then she summarized the investigation: unauthorized alteration of patent filings, concealed ownership structures, fraudulent licensing chains, misrepresentation of authorship, financial self-dealing through shell corporations. With each sentence, Daniel's face drained of color. Then she announced the ruling. I was formally recognized as the sole primary inventor on 7 core technologies and majority co-inventor on 4 others. All disputed patents were permanently reassigned to my ownership. All licensing revenue generated from those patents over the past 4 years would be returned to me with interest. A collective breath moved through the hall. She continued. Daniel was found personally responsible for intentional misappropriation of intellectual property and financial concealment. His former company would be placed under regulatory supervision. Criminal referrals were issued to financial prosecutors in 3 jurisdictions. All future executive roles were barred pending investigation. At that moment, the cameras turned toward him. He did not stand. He did not protest. He simply sat there, motionless, as if his body had not yet accepted what his mind already knew. Reporters rushed forward. Security moved between him and the aisle. The man who had once taken the stage as a visionary was escorted quietly out through a side exit, not arrested, but erased. Then something unexpected happened. The chair turned toward me. She invited me to the stage. My lawyer squeezed my hand once before I walked forward. The hall was silent except for the hum of cameras. I stood where Daniel had once presented my work as his own, and for a moment the past almost tried to return. But I did not let it. I spoke about beginnings, about working alone in a borrowed lab with secondhand equipment and ideas no one believed in, about building prototypes with my own hands, about trusting a partner who understood my science but not my integrity, about losing everything and deciding not to disappear. I did not insult him. I did not celebrate his fall. I spoke about why innovation belongs to those who create it and why silence only protects the powerful. When I finished, the applause did not explode. It rose slowly, steadily, until the entire hall was standing. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. Universities invited me to lead research teams. Ethical investment firms offered funding without conditions. 3 international companies licensed my technology directly under transparent contracts. I reopened my laboratory, this time with my name on the door and my ownership in every line of code and every design file. Daniel disappeared from the industry. His trial began quietly months later. The press lost interest when there were no more stages and no more speeches. He became another cautionary case in business ethics seminars, another footnote in regulatory textbooks. Once, long after the ruling, he sent a letter. No threats this time. Just a single sentence. I never thought you would survive without me. I never replied. Because the truth was simple. I had never needed him. I needed only the courage to reclaim what was mine. And when I finally looked at the patents framed on my office wall, bearing only my name, I understood something that no contract had ever taught me. Revenge was not exposing him. Victory was building a future he would never be part of. The end.